Hello, good evening, and a big welcome here to 5 by 15 on a special night in April. And it's lovely to see you all. And it does finally feel, although it's a bit chilly, as though spring has in fact arrived. And I couldn't be more thrilled to be welcoming all our speakers to us here to 5 by 15 tonight. Many of them, well, 4 of them have all been with us before, and we have one super surprise for you joining us from New York. These are wonderful storytellers, and you're going to hear some extraordinary stories over the next hour and a bit. So sit back and enjoy, and please buy their books, because I've read them all and they're all absolutely great. And the details will be in the chat, and Stephanie will be putting them in shortly. And our bookseller, Neon Books, who we work with, who win all the awards for one of the best independent bookstores in Britain, will be really happy to help you out. So sit back and enjoy. And our first speaker tonight is the wonderful, brilliant Elif Shafak, who has talked at 5 by 15 and beguiled us with her extraordinary stories over the years. She's a Turkish British writer, Booker Prize-shortlisted author. She's written 19 books, as well as being a really powerful thinker and communicator about what happens in the world today. You can watch Elif talking in so many languages about really important subjects. Her latest novel is the best-selling The Island of the Missing Trees. And as ever with Elif, she tells you about big universal stories, but she wraps the big universal truths, which she wraps up in stories. She is the master storyteller of my life, and I'm always absolutely entranced to listen to her speak. So Elif, it is great to see you again. Thank you so much for being with us, and over to you.
Rosie, thank you so much. It's great to be with you. I'm very excited to join you this evening. 5 by 15 is quite special. It was always special, but I think in the time of pandemic, in the time of war, at a time when we're all being pulled in different directions and being pushed into boxes, these connections are all the more important. And I want to talk about connections. More specifically, I want to talk about trees, roots, and how much we can learn from them. My new novel, I want to share with you this very short dedication that it has at the very beginning. It is dedicated to immigrants and exiles everywhere, the uprooted, the rerouted, the rootless, and to the trees we left behind, rooted in our memories. And this is what I want to base this talk on. I think there is a direct relation between trees and memories. I have observed this a lot on both sides of the Atlantic, especially in immigrant families. People do have an emotional connection with the trees they have left behind. So I want to focus on this connection between trees, memories, and identity. How does it feel to be rooted, uprooted? Is it possible to find new roots in another place? All of these questions, they're not only intellectual issues for me, they're also quite emotional issues, and they resonate with me personally as well. But I should tell you that my latest novel, I have written about Cyprus. This is a story that takes place in 2 islands, both the UK and Cyprus. And as you know, as many of you who've been to the island already know, this is a beautiful place with beautiful people, north and south. But at the same time, it's a very difficult story to tackle because we're talking about a divided island. As we're speaking, there's a partition line that cuts across the island of Cyprus, which literally separates Christians from Muslims and Greek Cypriots from Turkish Cypriots. So it's drawn along religious lines and national lines or ethnic lines. And so the difficulty for me was, how do you even approach such a subject as a storyteller without yourself falling into the trap of nationalism or tribalism, especially in a place where the past is not a bygone affair, where the past is very much alive, breathing within this present moment. How do you approach memory if there are conflicting and clashing memories and the past changes depending on whom you're talking to? And there are lots of untold stories and unhealed wounds. I struggled. I couldn't find an opening, an entrance into the story until I found a fig tree, which might sound weird, but helped me to tell the story that I had in mind. So in many ways, I feel grateful to this fictional, imaginary fig tree that partly narrates the book. Now, trees are important, roots are important, but also this theme of burial and unburial is important for me to tell this story. There's a botanical technique that I observed many immigrant families following, especially in cold cities like Chicago or Michigan. I have met immigrant families coming from all over the Mediterranean who are quite fond of their fig trees. If there's an extremely harsh winter, sometimes they bury their fig trees under the ground during those coldest weeks of the year. So these vertical trees become horizontal. You dig a trench under the ground, you prune the trees, and then you gently push them under the ground. They lose some of their roots, and then you cover them, and come next spring, you unbury them. I was very intrigued by this technique, but also the theme of burial and unburial is quite crucial in order to understand places that have experienced civil war and ethnic violence. In Cyprus, as you might know, there's a bicommunal organization called the Committee on Missing Persons. And I have a lot of respect for people who work for this committee, many of whom are volunteers, many of whom are young and also women. There are lots of women working for this organization, and they come from all walks of life, all disciplines. And basically what they're doing is they're digging the ground to find the bones of the people who went missing during the time of troubles. And the reason why they're doing this is not because they want to revive old animosities, not because, you know, they want to dig into the past in that sense, just the opposite. They want to give the dead a proper burial. If there are any mass graves, they want to find the mass graves as well. And also they want to give the families a possibility for healing and closure. Because if we cannot remember, we cannot repair what's broken. And when we don't repair, we're bound to repeat sometimes the same mistakes over and over again. So finding the bones of people who went missing is a crucial part of the healing of communities. And of course, this is not only important in Cyprus, it has been important in different parts of the world, such as in South America, in Guatemala, in Argentina, in Chile, or in Spain after the Civil War, in Bosnia after the genocide, and more recently after the Yazidi genocide across Iraq. There have been, and Syria, there have been families who are digging the ground to find the bones of their loved ones or their ancestors. So I'm very drawn to this theme of burial, unburial. How do we as writers find those buried stories, untold stories? Now, when I started this talk, I said that we have a lot to learn from trees. I think they help us to think about roots in a completely different way. We always think of roots as something that is buried in the ground and quite static, but in fact, they're not like that, and they don't have to be like that. There's a fascinating legend about the baobab tree, which is, when you look at it, it's almost like an upside down tree with roots almost like up in the air. And to me, this is important because I am someone who likes to think about multiple belongings. Is it possible to learn from multiple places? Is it possible to have a multiplicity of identities rather than a single thread of identity? Just like when you cut down or when you look at a tree trunk, you will see circles widening. I think it's possible to think of identity in a similar way. So rather than believing in monolithic identities, I want to think of fluid, multiple belongings. And there's a Greek philosopher, I want to leave you with this thought, Hieroglyphs, who wrote about this long time ago. He mentioned that you have attachments to your family, your local town, your country, but then as those attachments grow and grow, you're also a citizen of humanity, a citizen of the world. So I just want to leave you with that image. Instead of thinking of identity as something that is static, instead of thinking of roots as something that is necessarily buried in one place, is it possible to think of them in more concentric circles, in more fluid terms, and celebrate the multiplicity, the pluralism, the multitudes that we all have as human beings.
Elif, thank you so much. I was so loved your book and reading about another way of thinking about trees. We've had a lot of talks about trees lately, and I suppose for me what it's made me also think is that it makes you have a different concept of time, because of course trees do everything we do. They form communities, they cooperate, they reproduce, they live, they grow, they die. They just do it at a completely different speed, and we are so ignorant of that, as well as you say, the roots that join them all and join us all. So that was really lovely to hear, and thank you. It's very important message for right now. So wonderful, thank you. Our next speaker I know has, in her talk, she has a slide of a tree, and there is a reason, of course, for this tree. Julia Samuel, who's speaking next, is a quite extraordinary psychotherapist who wrote several books, which is her third book. Her first book was called The Grief Works. Her second book was called This Too Shall Pass. Julia was the founder of the Child Bereavement UK, and so she spent a lot of her life counselling families at the direst moment of their lives, the unimaginable moment which no one can even dare to let their imaginations go to. Julia went there with them, and her first book, Grief Works, took you through some of these stories. She evolved a fantastic formula, which was to take individual cases with families or groups or people who she had worked with therapeutically and use their minutiae to tell the bigger stories. Now, this book, Every Family Has a Story, is pretty much what it says on the tin. How do families operate? At the end of the day, they're the most important things in people's lives, and yet they're the things that are sometimes just the hardest to get right. So, Julia, thank you so much for joining us. It's absolutely lovely to see you again, bringing your third book to talk to all of us. And again, you see families being scattered and spread around in this horrible moment, and it's nothing more timely than to talk about them. So, big welcome here.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And it feels like Elif and I have gone through a completely different lens, saying very similar things and themes. So I feel very touched by what she said, and I think there are links between the two of us. So my book, Every Family Has a Story, and its kind of byline, every family has a story of love and loss and joy and pain. And all of you watching will have your own family story, which you'll probably think about as I speak. The story that I was told when I was a child was that everything was fine, that there wasn't anything going wrong, although there had been multiple unresolved traumas. And that everything that was talked about didn't matter, as it turned out, and all the things that were important were never voiced. And that, I think, really is the root of me becoming a therapist, because I, in the end, became much more interested in finding out what people were feeling and thinking on the inside than what they were saying. And so I've been a therapist for over 30 years. And every client that has walked through my door through those 30 years, whatever their presenting issue, has brought their family with them, their family of origin. I mean, this is in their words, their family of origin, or the family that they're making, spending great tracts of time trying to work out what has been going on. And one of the strong things that I learned from those clients as they walked through my door was what in one generation, the suffering of one generation that doesn't get resolved, passes down to the next generation until someone is prepared to feel the pain. And for that reason, I became very interested in multi-generation families. I think we've spent way too much time talking individually and talking about ourselves individually and about parenting, and not nearly enough focus has been on the family system, all of the generations and how they influence and shape each other. And I wanted to look at why some families thrive through adversity and why others fragment. And for me, the most personal is the most universal. So I always work with real families, and these stories that I tell, there are 8 case studies, are real families. And I worked with 3 and 4 generations of families all on a Zoom screen with me. And they were a very diverse mix. There was a Black Afro-Caribbean family who'd had a child that died. There was an Italian family where there'd been suicide 40 years before. There was a gay couple who were adopting a baby. And the family I'm going to tell you a little bit about today was a 5-generation ultra-Orthodox Jewish family. And I learned so much from all of these stories, things that I sort of knew already, but you kind of learn again when you work with people. And Catty was the great-grandmother. She was 92. She was a Holocaust survivor. And what we know psychotherapeutically, and I'm sure all of you do, is that there's transgenerational trauma. A lot of the research has been done in Israel that particularly survivors of the Holocaust, one of the things people say is they survived Auschwitz, but they died in Auschwitz because the trauma is so intense and gets passed down. So that's what I expected to see when I saw these 5 little windows on my Zoom screen. And that is not what I saw, because this family did not have transgenerational trauma. And trauma is not inevitable. And the thing that influenced this particular family, this unique family, was genetics. Catty was a sparkly, bright-eyed 92-year-old. And the leap I made was that she was probably a sparkly 14-year-old, which is why she wasn't picked by Mengele, why she was given the odd piece of potato or the odd cake, and that enabled her to survive. And she also had very secure attachment roots, as Elif was sharing, that I could feel the warm Hungarian kitchen that she came from, decades later. She felt very loved, and that love for her parents and her siblings who had all been murdered was very much alive and present in her, and that protected her. And she had hope. Hope is the alchemy that turns a life around. And she said a very simple sentence. She said, I wanted to see what would happen next. And the final piece of her jigsaw of how she not only survived but thrived is that the meaning she made of her experience. She said to her children, I survived so I could marry Isaac, her much beloved husband, so that I could have you. And so she was by no means traumatized. But there were behaviors that did get passed down to every member of the family, even the 21-year-old great-granddaughter, which was none of them could wear stripes. They were all frightened of dogs, particularly barking dogs. And chimneys always sparked in them a fear of the gas chimneys. It kind of brought that to them. And this was a family that worried. So in some ways, they alchemized the trauma into worry. I mean, all of us, the research shows, we worry more now about our children than ever in history. But they worried a lot and they protected each other and they didn't like fights. So they always wanted to keep everything under the radar. So there is a cost in that of your emotional self, that if you have to kind of guard yourself and protect each other, that is quite a kind of binding way of behaving. And the biggest thing was that Catty was a tough act to follow. So whenever something bad happened to them, they would say to themselves, well, I lost my job, but I mean, I wasn't in Auschwitz. I can't feel bad about that. So they would always kind of diminish their experiences because it was compared to Catty. And they were an incredible, loving family. And of course, the thing that sustained them, being an ultra-Orthodox Jewish family, was their faith and the structure of their faith and their belief. And that enabled them to overcome even those small difficulties that they faced. But what was also interesting is that although I live a completely different life and way of life, I saw so much of myself in them and learned so much. So, I mean, what did I learn from the 8 families that I work with? I learned that where we love most, we hate most, we fight most, and we make our deepest mistakes. which is why families drive us mad. It's because we care so much, and that we're always on a spectrum of functional and dysfunctional, depending on the external pressures, like a pandemic, which I think put families under the most enormous pressure. There is no perfect family. And I think often now with social media, there is this idea of a perfect family, of kind of curated family life. And we all know that the foundation of a secure, functioning family, good enough family, is the underpinning emotion of love. But love, you know, is not a soft skill. Love is difficult. Love in receiving love, love in giving love, love in action, loving stepping back, loving moving forward, loving letting go. How you do that within all the different generations of your family is a skill that can be learned and is complex. But with that love, the thing that when I looked at how do some families thrive in adversity, it is the love, the quality of the connection and the intention of goodwill between every family member that in the end allowed them and enabled them to hold together even when they faced the most difficult challenges, because they had their family as the bedrock of their life that they could turn to when all of the rest of the world was falling apart. And that was probably the most important thing that enabled them to overcome. And so looking at that led me to devise these 12 touchstones. These aren't like how to, like do these 12 things and everything's going to be fine. It's more that if your family is feeling quite off kilter, you could look at some of these touchstones. It's for the well-being of family, and think about, you know, am I allowing some of these things? Is there change and I'm not allowing it? And, you know, are we having enough fun as a family? I think in the pandemic, we certainly haven't had enough fun. And when we kind of choose to put down our tasks, have fun together and play with different versions of ourselves. And as Elif says, when we build those memories, we go back to them. We go back to them in our minds and in our memories and in the places, and they can be key for the rest of our lives. The other really big one is self-compassion, is that from each other, we observe how everyone behaves. And if your mum or your parent or your grandparent has what I call a shitty committee, is criticizing themselves, they're not self-compassionate, that's what we observe and that's what we do. So if we can be kind to ourselves, that's what we'll show our family member. And the other kind of important one, which I think we kind of shy away from, although it happens all the time, is to fight productively. Again, similar to what Elif was saying, it's never about not having a fight. There will always be different disagreements in families. It's allowing the rupture, the fight, but how you repair, that you intentionally use the fight as a context to understand each other better, to get closer, to make sense of what really is going on beneath the fight about the bins or whatever it is on top. And that you can resolve the fight, and so it is properly repaired, and you don't use that same fight as the list of the laundry list of things that you're furious about that you bring back to the next fight. So it's properly kind of cleaned and put away. And one of the things that came up a lot with the families was, how do we have these difficult conversations? Not everyone can see a therapist like you. And one of the things I think is most helpful is walking and talking as a family. Being out in nature, being outside enables you to have the rhythm of being side by side, not eyeball each other. If anyone asks a child or a grandparent, what are you feeling? No, they will always want to punch you. But if you're outside and walking along in rhythm together, looking at the ground, having space for silence, then one person can begin to have a question of, that was, why are we fighting every Sunday? Or you can begin to explore what is really going on beneath the surface. And so my last question for you is, maybe the hidden stories from the past are the things that are secretly contaminating your life. So if you feel there's something wrong with you or there's something missing, my suggestion to you is perhaps it didn't start with you. Look up, explore, ask questions, find the untold stories, the secrets, the shame, the suicides, the deaths, all of the things that have gone wrong. Because the story you tell yourself is the person you become. And if you change your story, that does change your outcome. And you can begin to imagine that the family that you want is the first step in telling yourself the story of who you're going to be.
Julia, that was so wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so full of wisdom and interest and so much to think about. Yeah, I think people are very lucky if they find themselves on the receiving end of your therapy. Very lucky indeed. Anyway, it's great that you've shared it with so many through your wonderful book. I can't recommend it enough. Welcome now to our next speaker, another person who's been a regular at 5x15. Matt, it's great to see you. Dr. Matthew Green is, a regular for 5x15. He's a historian, he's a writer, he's a broadcaster, and he's also the founder of the Unreal City Audio. And he's recently written this incredibly intriguing book, which he's going to talk to us about tonight, called Shadowlands, which looks at the sort of dead ends of history, or places that have been abandoned through plague or natural phenomena or war, or because the economics of the situation have just moved on. I can't really think of a more topical subject to be discussing tonight. Again, Matt, thank you very much, because Shadowlands, I know, is out in the bestseller list, so I know you're hugely in demand to give talks. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm very amused to see Matt is in a friend's house using his more high-powered internet, and I noticed that he's tidied up his room. That I was forced to. He was forced to. That's a bit unfair, but anyway, the room is looking super tidy, Matt, and thank you very much for coming here to talk about Shadowlands. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen so we can go. This is working. There we go. Okay. So the landscape of Britain, although we don't always realize it, is scarred with the haunting remains of lost cities, ghost towns, and vanished villages. These were places that were once brimming with life and full of hopes and dreams and bells and vision. But now, sadly, for the most part, they're just spectral echoes, which are in the cold grip of the earth. And over the last 4 years or so, I've been on what sounds like rather a morbid journey, but actually it was rather uplifting and cathartic by the end. An itinerary of destruction through these places, not just to resurrect the past, but also to hopefully bring into focus the fragility of the present, and also in some cases, I'm afraid, to present an awful premonition of our likely future. So the journey began, in the first instance, on a windy beach in Orkney, where I encountered this, which I think some of you will hopefully agree. It looks rather incongruous. When I first saw it, it resembled, I thought, a crazy golf course. And that shouldn't blind us to the significance of this site. This was, when it was built, one of the most extraordinary things that had ever been built up until that point. It's not really that much of an exaggeration to say it's the point from which our entire civilized history unfurls in these islands. And how funny then to think that this was lain concealed for over 5,000 years in that antithesis of form, sand, until in the year 1850, a cataclysmic sea storm, the first of many in the book, ended up like ripping off the grassy knoll from the dune and revealing inside a series of identically sized huts, about 8 in number, connected by a slithering passageway and sunk in wraps of its own primeval muck. So what you're looking at is actually older than Stonehenge. It's older even than the pyramids. And when this was built, it was just fantastically avant-garde because it was built in that great transition period between humankind being marauding hunter-gatherers and actually putting down roots, establishing fixed communities sustained by agriculture. And it must have seemed like a doomed experiment. The book is, as Rosie said, full of false starts and dead ends. And quite a lot of people must have thought, well, this was never going to take off. Because at the time, as I'm sure a lot of you know, built structures tended to be for the dead, not the living. They wanted to kind of dignify their meager lifespans with this kind of cosmic significance. And for 2.5 million years, we'd been marauding around. And now we were going to work the land and husband animals for our own sustenance. And to everyone's surprise, it worked, it survived. So it was built around 3200 BC and flourished for the next 750 years. So when you see the sites, which you can go and visit, you can go and walk, you can go and peer in, much of it does seem fairly alien. There's a really sort of eerie, uncanny sense that the residents have just left. This is prehistory as well, so there's no written sources. We don't really know, it's just guesswork, what their worldviews were, the kind of structure of society, how they saw their place in the world. So most of the time, all you can really hear is the wind in your ears. But at the same time, there is this really sort of strange kind of familiarity. Just look into that. It contains much of what I bet you're all looking at, if you're not looking at me, in your living rooms this evening. It's got fireplaces, it's got cupboards, it's got mantelpieces, it's got tables, it's got chairs, it's even got fridges that contain the swirling limpets. So this kind of sense of mellow domesticity brings a kind of flicker of warmth and familiarity that does challenge our relationship with deep time and sort of cuts through the cold abyss of millennia. 100 people lived here up until the year 2500, or round about that point, at which point the entire community mysteriously vanishes. So no one really knows whether it was because of the sandstorm, whether it was because some kind of plague, whether the young drained away, or because bronze had replaced stone and that changed the sort of calibration of society. We just don't know. But this did prove that settled communities could be a success story in these isles, paved the way for all the towns, cities and burgs and villages that followed in its wake. The biggest efflorescence of which was in the early Middle Ages. And you can see here, Skara Brae, look how close the sea is getting towards it. So perhaps having vanished once, it may soon vanish again. One of these medieval cities, I just want to sort of show you a picture of it now, and hopefully you'll be able to admire all the streets, the lanes, the alleys, the cathedral, the hawk houses, the graveyards and the rest of it, all the other accoutrements of a medieval city in all its glory. So here it is. I'm sure the collective intake of breath that I can't hear because you're all muted. It's all underneath the rippling waves of the narrow seas. Old Winchelsea in Sussex was established in Saxon times and arose to great prominence by the 13th century. It was a sort of tagliatelle, if you like, of twisting, winding streets parceled in seawater. And the whole thing was built on a great shingle spit. Now that might sound like the most insane thing in the world to have built a city on. But for anyone who's ever been to the great shingle promontory of Dungeness, which Old Winchelsea lay off, actually it was pretty firm ground. It gave unrivaled access to that highway of commerce, the sea, and it rapidly grew to become an entrepot of wood and herring and salt and delicious, frothy, light pink wine from Gascony. So far, so good, until round about the middle of the 13th century, the medieval warm period gave way to the Little Ice Age. And as we know to our own cost, when you have these big climatic shifts, they're often accompanied by unusually tempestuous weather, and storms battered the city of Old Winchelsea from 1250 The monk Matthew Paris, with apocalyptic glee, no relation to the journalist, I don't think, talked about kind of entire rows being clawed off and falling into the sea. And then in 1288, he describes how, you know, the sun vanished from view, the sky turned black, and the entire city was lost in the undulating mountains of the sea. A few months before, the King Edward I had rocked up on, I guess, what we would describe as a fact-finding mission. He was a macho king. He wasn't going to let anything as puny as nature lay low his favourite cinque port, but he did observe how much of Old Winchelsea is drowned and the rest hopeless long to stand, which I think are haunting words both in his day and our own. So he decided, like a precious relic in a cathedral, he was going to rebuild it. He was going to translate the city on a hill several miles inland, where, safe from the ravages of the sea, it would rise up again as the greatest cinque port. And it's sort of like two fingers up to nature. Rather unusually for a medieval city, he forged it to this gridiron layout with these intersecting arrow-straight thoroughfares, showing that he was going to tame these wild forces that had so drowned the predecessor city. So you can see there's an absolutely vast tidal estuary to the north, which it shared with Rye, and ships would dock from all over Europe. And one of the most sort of ubiquitous things you'd find in New Winchelsea were these little sort of stone cellars leading underground, which are quite drab and moribund places today, but back then they were sort of alive with lute music and flickering gargoyles and merchants piercing these barrels, and out of which would gush what they described as the creator of the world's happiness, or an elixir that removes sorrow and takes it away from the soul, which is of course wine. It was wine that gave it its swagger and prosperity and status. It was a very cosmopolitan place with about between 5,000 and 10,000 people. By 1350, it seemed nothing could stop the inexorable rise of New Winchelsea, which makes it all the odder that when you visit today, there's no station. The Breed, I was worried about how I was going to get across it, but it's sort of dwindled to this pathetic, dismal little stream, which you can basically skip across. Then you see a gate on the horizon, you go through expecting to find the kind of medieval core, and it's just dead. To say it's sleepy is an understatement. It's comatose. There's one shop, there's one pub with a dismal wine list, very unlike these 90 wine caves. And then when you walk further south, where this Monday market was, the entire thing just gives way to these kind of lonely green fields. It just stops, and you walk over these strange dips and bumps, and you realize all the streets are now underground. And you walk for what feels like miles, and you find a sight that sort of makes the soul quiver, which is the new gate, which was once one of the main entrances to the city. Now it's just marooned in rustic isolation. So how on earth did you go from one to the other? Well, having laid low the predecessor city, nature had played a particularly cruel trick on New Winchelsea, in that the sea retreated. A new accumulation of shingle meant that the harbour silted up. The entire thing became exsanguinated. It was helped on its way by the Black Death and by about 7 burnings at the hands of the French and the Castilians. By the 1560s, there was just one sailor left and no boats, so we don't know how he sailed. And then in 1722, Daniel Defoe reached a similar conclusion to me, really. He said, nothing of the city but the destruction of it seems to remain. So what do we see in these ruins? Because you'd think that it would be quite depressing, but actually they're strangely cathartic and uplifting. I felt, as I was writing this book, going through a period of bereavement, divorce, and God knows whatever else. And actually, the more you meditate upon these ruins, the sort of less of a ruin you become yourself. And they sort of emblematize how an absence can actually have much more presence than something that is still there. And as Henry James said about Dunwich, another lost city, he says, you know, the minor key is struck with such felicity, it leaves no sigh unbreathed. So by the end of it, it's actually rather a sort of, you know, discordantly cathartic experience. That's Winchelsea today. That's what it once was. Talking of why people were drawn to vanishing and abandoned and places that are marooned in the margins of time, St Kilda, I'm sure lots of you, or some of you, have dared to make the journey there. And many were the sort of philosophical voyages of the 18th century that sort of saw these sort of great fangs of rocks as though they'd crash landed from heaven. And in the 18th century, they thought this would be some sort of empirical test to find out what natural man was like beneath the accretions of civilization, which were ever more conspicuous in the 18th century. So was natural man a Hobbesian brute or some kind of prelapsarian innocent? That was the question, and they were delighted to find these people living a very primitive style life, as they said. Obviously it's mediated through their travellers' reports, grabbing fulmars and puffins from the stacks. They had no concept, apparently, of property, of money. Luxuries like tobacco and coffee were unknown to them, and to everyone's delight, there was no crime, there was no adultery. They didn't even have locks on the door, so it seemed to confirm this Lockean sort of Shaftesbury idea of kind of natural morality that flowed between a sort of shared empathy between human beings. Unfortunately, they were also aware that their very presence was corrupting this way of life, introducing tokens of the civilized world, like tobacco, like alcohol, making the whole community less dependent upon this sort of bird grabbing, which was fine when the ships turned up, but less fine when they didn't. And by the Victorian period, entire steamers full of tourists arrived, and they sort of commodified the whole way of life. So the Kildans begin to collude with these prejudicial expectations, pretending they didn't know what a mirror was, pretending they didn't know what a gun was, filling the islanders with a sense of wanderlust, making it clear that there was an easier life to be had elsewhere, until in 1930, the final islanders, 36 in number, have their final meal of bird soup. They round up their dogs, throw them in the bay, drown them, and then they sail off to a new life on the horizon. And that was the end of the community of St Kilda. You can see here them like vultures staring at them. Very briefly, because we're very much running out of time, St Kilda was abandoned deliberately, or willingly rather. The same cannot be said for Capel Caelan in Trewyrin, an idyllic, one of the sole remaining Welsh-speaking villages left in North Wales, drowned beneath 68 billion gallons of water to slake the industrial thirst of Liverpool, with these councillors here who look rather like Hitchcock villains. And there was the mother of all resistance campaigns, to no avail, and it was seen as a constitutional outrage, a latest manifestation of England's oppression of Wales. But all the villagers could do was to stand on the banks and watch as their former houses went under. And that for me was probably the most haunting place I visited, a metaphor as well for the ravages of human behavior, man-made climate change. So I wish that what I've been talking about tonight was safely confined to the pages of history. Not the case, as anyone who lives in Skipsea will tell you, or Fairborn in Wales, and not just coastal villages, but riverine and coastal cities as well, not least London. Many reports have showed that by 2090, vast swaths of London will be underwater. So as it's said of Dunwich, if you can stand on those crumbling cliffs in Suffolk, you're meant to be able to hear the 50 bells clanging from the deep. Who knows, perhaps in not that long a period, unless we have truly radical action to intervene globally, we'll be standing on Hampstead Heath, listening down for the ghostly bells of the submerged Wren churches in the watery wasteland below. So on that uplifting note, I'll hand back to Rosie. Thank you very much for listening.
Matt, thank you so much. That was completely riveting. And I very much like what you said about getting some kind of comfort from these ruins, but I thought it was quite scary. I was reminded of Adam Nicholson's The Sea Room, when you were talking about the Shants and how they went along for literally thousands of years keeping about 40 sheep, and then come the Industrial Revolution, someone thought it would be great to keep a couple of hundred sheep, and within 20 years they were all bankrupt and they'd all left the island because they had nothing to eat and the sheep had killed the whole place. And that was it. That was the end of a community, and that things can happen so fast.
Yeah.
But
and you never know if you're in the shadow of annihilation until it's too late.
No, you don't. And I mean, actually, the whole world is somewhat in that shadow.
Sadly, yeah.
But thank you very, very much. And I'm so glad your book is doing so well. But I have to say, I'm not a bit surprised. It's an extraordinary subject and you've done it wonderfully. So thank you and great to see you. Our next speaker was herself almost annihilated through illness recently. Delia, are you with us? Are you online? I need you to turn on your screen. I will keep, here you are, Delia Efron. So welcome to 5 by 15. Delia Efron is an enormously wonderful screenwriter, novelist of many books. She wrote the fantastic film, which I think probably lots of us have seen, called You've Got Mail. She's the sister of the late Nora Ephron, again, another very famous American female writer. Nora died of cancer. Delia's husband died, which is where the book opens. Delia herself carried many of the same genes as her sister. And the book opens on a tremendously dramatic note. And it's hard to know, well, the book is also a love story and it's very gripping. I am now going to talk to Delia for the next 15 minutes about this book. I'll try not to overrun the time, but I will just say about this book that all the way through it, in particular about 3/4 of the way through it, I kept thinking, oh my God, she's going to die. She's going to die. And then I'd go, no, she's not dead because she wrote this book and I've seen a picture of her. But it's that thrilling. And Delia, so can you tell us, you say this begins with the very sad occasion of the death of your long married husband, Jerry, and then pick us up from there. And welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. This book is called Left on 10th. I live on 10th Street in Greenwich Village in Manhattan, and Left on 10th is my way home. And the night that my late husband died, it's a very traumatic moment because I had done everything I could so he could die at home in his bed in our bedroom, and I had gotten all the papers. You need special forms in this country and everything. So they told me, put it on the refrigerator, and if he falls, just call up the fire department and they'll send they're called the EMTs, the emergency people that come over, and they'll just lift him up and put him back in bed, so he fell and I needed him put back in bed, and he was very sick. I knew he was within the last couple of nights of his life, and there were 5 EMTs showed up and they refused to do what I asked. They said, no, he's under the jurisdiction of the fire department. And I'm getting in this crazy night of Jerry on the floor and me shouting at the 5 EMTs. And then I noticed there were 2 policemen in the apartment, and I'm thinking, this is way too many people to be in an apartment in New York City. And, I just could not even believe it. I just wanted him lifted up and put back in bed. And it just went on. And finally, I just went, I just started crying. I started wailing and bawling and I've done everything to keep him at home. And well, they got nicer. And I to this day, I wonder if they needed to bully me to tears. But and I was, even when I was crying, I was thinking, now am I doing this because I know it's the only move left? But anyway, they did get nicer, and they called up the fire department doctor, and he said, oh, just put your husband back, just ask them to put your husband back in bed. And then they did, and then they left, and I was so wiped out. I think I have plans for how it could be, how his death could be. And I don't think death is ever interested in what your plans are, really. And I was so completely zonked from dealing with this that, I fell asleep for the first time, not in the room with him. And because I had a night nurse, and I came up at 3 a.m. and he was gone. you know, and I just said it like, he's dead. It's just like, it was like they'd beaten me into bluntness, you know, and I never cried again. It was like that whole night, it just sucked it all out of me. Anyway, this book takes you on a journey from that night through my year alone and all sorts of very strange things that then happened. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this story, which is about 4 years of my life when just about everything awful that could happen to me did happen to me, was that it was such an extraordinary story, and there was so much luck and confluence in it and serendipity that it made me wonder about things like miracles, and if luck wasn't just another word for miracle. And so you know, anyway, go on. What else do you want to know here?
So you talk about miracles. So the book has the start with Jerry's death. Then, in fact, the miracle happens, and then the kind of anti-miracle happens. So the first miracle is obviously the contact from Peter.
Yes, but you see, everything came out of the strangest thing. I decided I had to disconnect Jerry's landline after about 6 months. And then I got into a huge battle with our phone company, and they disconnected my internet by accident, and I couldn't get it back. So I was on the phone with them. I don't know if you have this in England, but the prompts were just endless, and I kept getting disconnected and having to call back and go through them all. So then I do what I did, which is I wrote a very funny piece about, you know, being on hold with the phone company and missing Jerry. And it ran in the New York Times. And I must say, a lot of people in this country really hate their phone companies, because I got a lot of mail. And one of the letters was several months later, I got a letter from Peter. And he is Peter is a Jungian analyst, a doctor, psychiatrist, who lived in the Bay Area then, which is north of San Francisco. And it was just a very strange thing, because I had just been invited to speak at a conference of Jungians in Texas. And I thought to myself, what's a Jungian? I better meet one and find out. And lo and behold, one arrives in my email. And then the last trip he'd taken had been to Syracuse, which is a falling down place in Sicily. And that's the title of my last book. And not that many people go there. So, and most importantly, really, we had had a date. We actually still can't agree on how many dates we had. We had at least 2 dates 54 years ago, which I do not remember. And 54 years before, and Nora had fixed us up, my older sister. So he came blessed by my sister. And it was really a pretty amazing thing, because I had dealt with so much loss, and I was so grief stricken, and to be in love was to just suddenly feel the kind of feelings that, you know, I didn't even know they were there anymore. So it was like the sun was shining suddenly. It was so miraculous, and it came out of this fluky thing. And then, you know, he flew east. We fell in love over emails. All the emails are in Left on 10th. They're all in there, because when I wrote the book, I looked at them, and it was really how our love story started. And I thought, well, I've fallen into my own romantic comedy. And then 4 months later, I got diagnosed with AML, which is a fierce leukemia. And so then the second half of then Peter proposed that weekend that I found out, and we got married in the hospital while I was having my first chemo treatments. And, you know, part of what was kind of amazing about this also was that I got to have many new treatments that did not exist 5 years before. I just had this great, that's what I mean about confluence. There was a drug that was just coming onto the market called CPX-351 that put me into remission. It hadn't even been there 5 years before. And then I had a very special kind of, a year later when it came back, I had a very unique transplant, a Haplocore transplant, which is two people, two donors. Because if you don't have a match, you can get a donation of a cord blood from a baby, which is very much more adaptable. But you need another donation at the same time, because that adult donation kind of keeps your body going while the little baby cord bloods go to your marrow and take root. So, I mean, the little stem cells. So I had all this amazing medicine, but what I really had was Peter by my side. And the journey was really terrible. I mean, it was a really traumatic journey. And my girlfriends, I had my friends, I call them my women warriors. They were there with me too. So when I decided to write the book, which was after I survived, which was, I'd been in the hospital 100 days and I had 6,000 pages of hospital records. After I survived, I didn't think I would write again. But, you know, after about a year, maybe even more, maybe almost two, my writer's heart started beating. And I looked at that and I thought, this is an extraordinary story and you get to tell it. Mm. So I got to research it. I got to call up my girlfriends and I got to go through all the emails that Peter sent to people in the hospital that were so positive. I couldn't believe that he never said, God, this is hell, because it was, but he didn't. He just maintained this belief that we were going to get out. And so he's such a hero. Yeah. So the book has, it's such a, well, of course I dedicated the book to him, but I mean, he's really was a hero. He really did. It was love and medicine that saved me. But it was helpful to write the book. I was glad I had the story to tell.
Was it difficult writing something so personal?
No, I mean, that's something I do and I know how to do it. And I knew that there was no writing this book unless you told the truth. And very weirdly, one of the hardest things to write was because it's also about friendship and dogs and all sorts of things that are happening along the way. And I lost my dog during the time when I was most vulnerable. And I could not admit that I wasn't with my dog, that I was on another side of the country from my dog. I had gone to California and I was in remission at that moment, but very rocky, feeling rocky. I'm frightened a lot. And I just couldn't get on a plane. I just couldn't. I was just too scared and I couldn't write it. And finally, I just said, just tell the truth. Tell the truth. You weren't, it's so funny. I mean, I'm telling you everything about my, swearing at everyone in the hospital, tearing my clothes off, doing all sorts of things that my friends told me I did. And I write that with no trouble. I get to my dog and I can't admit that I wasn't there. So I had to admit it.
I was very, very touched by the bit about the dog. I think I would have been equally unable to say that I wasn't there for the dog at the end, as you were. I mean, there are many, many astonishing medical things. I think the thing that absolutely tripped me up was when you wake up at some point and you discover you've got a whole new blood group. That was
that's the end. If you have a bone marrow transplant, I was type O blood when I started and then realized after that I was type A. And I was so stunned. And I mean, Peter says that if you change, your marrow is what produces your blood, and that's what you're replacing. Okay. So it doesn't get more basic than that. It doesn't. And he thinks, well, he's a doctor, but he thinks that it's like a heart transplant. Yeah. It's just there's no visible organ like that, so people don't really give it that, kind of credit. But he thinks the journey is as big.
I would absolutely agree, especially when you read it. So it's so fundamental, the blood that's been whizzing around your body all these years, and suddenly it's kind of joined another ship and well, you're going just fine. So has it been completely amazing to be able to restart your whole life in your 70s?
Yeah, actually, the simple answer to that is yes. I mean, I live in the same, I'm never leaving Dead Street. I live in my paradise. I love Greenwich Village. I love the world that I live in. I love my building. It still feels like a Greenwich Village building, and with a lot of people in it who are designers or artists or curators, but not fancy, not really. And so it suits me. I mean, I've found where I belong, which I think we should have found by that time. But it is kind of, it's very, look, it was scary. It was scary to start over. But I didn't mean to fall in love. It just happened. And I think being out there in life, that's what life is about. Unexpected, amazing things. You if it happens to you, don't run away from it. But I was scared, and I still am, because I lost someone I loved so deeply. And I know that one of us is going to lose the other. And that was hard for me. We really had to talk about it. Peter wasn't as frightened of it as me, but he's not as frightened as I am in general.
Well, he comes out of it as a truly great guy. And I think that you're both really lucky. And actually anyone who gets to read this, which has got love and hope, which you probably can't see inscribed into the cover, it's a fantastic read. I can't recommend it enough. I stayed up really, really, really late reading this book, as I say, egging Delia on. Well, okay. Very, very pleased to see that she has such beautiful hair, which anyone who now reads the book will understand. I'm so pleased that you took the time to join us. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much for having me.
We're just so pleased that you're well and writing again.
Thank you.
Please keep doing it. So thank you. Thanks so much. Well, that was really lovely. Thank you very much. What a great treat and a surprise and something very different. So on to our final speaker for tonight, who is Howard Jacobson. First time that Howard ever came to talk at 5 by 15, unless I have forgotten something, was literally the 2 days after he had just won the Booker Prize for the Finkler question. And he gave the most hilarious talk, and we were all falling about with laughter and of course with delight, because Howard was an extremely justified winner. He's written a memoir. It's called Mother's Boy, and it's subtitled A Writer's Beginning. It's an exploration in Howard's indomitable, inimitable style of being an insider and an outsider, of being Jewish, of being British. It's fantastically funny, very insightful, and of course totally brilliant. Howard, I'm so pleased to see you again. I know you're in a kind of COVID warren and you haven't come out, but this is one of the real benefits of Zoom, that we get to talk to you without being able to infect you with any rotten diseases. So thank you very much, and hello.
Hello, can you promise it can't come down the waves?
Yes, I can, I think. I think
Berger wrote stories about electricity coming out of people fearing electricity could leak from the plugs. Are you certain COVID can't come through my computer?
Yeah, and I think that's fake news, actually, Howard. I think that's fake news, but I don't know where you're standing on fake news today.
I was taught to look at life.
Well, look at life. I don't think it's going to come. We're just really pleased to see you. So tell us how you've been, and tell us.
I've set this. Just a minute. I've set this.
What are you doing? You trying to set
setting my timer.
Okay, go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Lovely to be back here in whatever the circumstances. So thank you. Can you die of not writing a novel? I thought I could. I thought at one point I just about had. But of course, you have to very much want to write a novel to believe that you can die of not writing it. And I very, very much wanted to write a novel. And I wonder whether this little book here might have a clue as to why. This little book is my mother's diary. My mother died a couple of years ago at a good age, 97. And it was in the middle of my writing Mother's Boy. I'm not sure I'd called it Mother's Boy yet, but I had to call it Mother's Boy then. And this came to me into my possession not long after she died. It is the most wonderful thing. It is the diary of a 17-year-old girl, as she was then. in the year 1940. Bombs are falling. She's going to she's uneducated. She left school at 14. She's working in a milliner's and she's collecting for hospitals, but she's reading everything. She's reading in the way that somebody who is doing a PhD in 19th century English literature wouldn't read today. She's reading everything. She's going to the theatre. She is fantastic. I fell in love with my mother all over again because, of course, I'd been in love with my mother. What boy isn't? What Jewish boy isn't? Reading this diary. It's full of life, full of vitality. It's sharp. She's got loads of boyfriends, one of whom is my father. She's a bit worried about my father because she says at one point he's being a little too amorous. Isn't that one of? He's a little too amorous. And at one point he says to her, "Unless you kiss me, I'm going to kill myself." She thinks that's unfair of him. Then he says, "Unless you kiss me, I'm going to get drunk. I'm going to go on a bender." Now, my father's idea of getting drunk is a kind of a very small lager and lime. So I can't see that ever happened. But in the end, he persuades her. He seems to have succeeded in persuading her by bringing her a box of black magic. 2 years later, I am born. So she's very young. You realize she's 19 when I am born. So between 1940 and 1942, everything's all right with my father. She marries him and I am born. This memoir begins uncontroversially with my being born. My mother is in a nursing home in Prestbury in Cheshire because the bombs are falling, still falling on London, but now they're really falling on London. And she's in this nursing home in Cheshire, and it's one of the hottest summers, late August, one of the hottest summers there's ever been. Imagine my mother talking. This is one of the hottest summers there has ever been. And the labor that she's having with me is one of the nurses tell her, this is one of the hardest, longest, most painful labors there has ever been. And as she lies there for days, bathed in sweat, a spider crawls up onto the coverlet, crawls across her and settles on her belly pretty well exactly where my brain would have been. So it becomes a kind of family mythology, or at least mythology between my mother and me, that a spider sat on my brain in my earliest years. I like this idea because it suggests that some emissary of hell has made some connection to me. I like the idea that that I am in this way destined for some diabolic, evil future. In fact, I'm a shy, embarrassed, awkward, nervous mother's boy. As early as in the first few days of birth? Well, I actually think so. I argued with my mother that I could remember everything that happened. And she would say, that's just rubbish. My mother always said, everything was rubbish. Any exaggeration I made was rubbish. She could exaggerate all she liked. She could exaggerate about the spider. It turned out in a later account that that spider could have been a fly. For me, that fly will always be a spider. That was an emissary of the devil. But my mother would not allow my exaggerations because she wanted the world to be full of her exaggerations. It was more than exaggeration, it was catastrophe that she dealt in. She was a catastrophist. For example, let me just leap for a moment from my birth, though I might go back to it. When I got a letter that I'd won a place at Cambridge. I'm 19 years old, 18, and a letter comes to say, you won a place at Cambridge. I tell my mother, I've got in. The house goes very still. She says, let me just take a look at that. Let me just take a look at the envelope. Let's be absolutely certain it's meant for you. Now, you could think that's the most insulting thing a mother could say to her son, that this cannot be for you, it must be for somebody else. But I know it wasn't meant to be insulting. It was meant to be loving. She didn't want me to be disappointed. Why? If it was not meant for me, why would it not have been meant for me? Because life is full of catastrophes. Now I want to ask, how did this woman who is at 17 was such a live wire, how did she, so free, so easy, so clever, so bright, how in the course of a few years did she turn into this catastrophist? how indeed did my father, who was in love with her and would do anything for a kiss, turn into somebody, well, he actually didn't turn into somebody opposite to the person he'd been when he was young. He turned into somebody more like the person he'd been when he was young. My mother and my father, without knowing it, represent two sides of a serious historical split in Judaism. One of the great schisms in 18th century Judaism was the schism between Lithuanian Jews and Ukrainian Jews. Ukrainian Jews produced Hasidism. That was that sort of muscular, hysterical, how can we put it? They talked about the rabbis would come tumbling down from the Ukraine into the rest of Europe. They were faith healers. They were magicians. It was a very, very muscular and entertaining kind of Judaism. Across the way in the Baltic, in Lithuania, the Lithuanians are looking at this and saying, no, that's not what Judaism means. Judaism is something more austere, something more scholarly, something more altogether serious and spiritual and holy. My mother was from Lithuania. My father was from Ukraine. Between them, they held each side of this major difference between Jews. And I am in the middle of this. I am their battlefield, if you like. And this explains to me, they didn't know anything about it. This explains to me why in 2 years my mother went from being that bright and breezy 17-year-old to being a woman that was full of anxiety. Of course, something else had happened. She'd had a baby, and we know what happens when you have a baby. The world suddenly becomes a more dangerous place. And my father went into the war. So for him too, the world had become a more dangerous place. But they fought the battle, this 18th century battle between two kinds of Judaism was fought out with me in the middle. It was so, I knew it to be absurd and I knew it to be preposterous while it was happening. And it's one of the reasons I think I wanted to be a writer. I thought this is so strange and it's making me feel so peculiar. I've got to have these pressures on me, because it was a pressure, with my mother worrying about everything that I did and my father saying, no, don't treat the boy like that. My father he didn't want me to be a sportsman, but he didn't want me to be rough, but he wanted me to have a bit more confidence. He wanted me to be a sport. He was always complaining that I wasn't a sport. When we went on holiday and we'd go to a pantomime and the people on the stage on the pantomime would say, okay, all the kids under 12, come up on the stage. I'd be hiding under the seat. My father would grab me by my neck, get up, go on there. He'd make me enter competitions. There's a little photograph of me somewhere in there wearing those Brillo pad trunks and my fists like that, trying to look, it was a Just William competition for my dad, trying to look like a tough guy. It's the saddest thing you've ever seen in your life. I didn't want to be like that. I didn't live in my body like my mother didn't live in her body. I lived in my mind. In fact, I lived in my mother's mind. My father wanted to get me out of my mother's mind, who can say it was wrong, and he wanted to get my mother out of my mind. He didn't succeed, though it is the case that when I was finally able to write, I probably became a lot more like my father. It probably took my father to do it. I wanted to be my father, though I was my mother. Another example of my mother's catastrophism. I mean, think of this. She rings me up at one point. Whenever she rang me up, the phone would be this implement of wild exaggeration. She held hyperbole in her hand, and she would say, "Oh, Howard, I can't tell you." I'd say, "Okay, what is it?" "Howard, I can't sleep. I can't." I said, "What is it? What's the matter?" "It's Stephen." Stephen was my younger brother. That's another story. Younger brothers are a problem for older brothers. "Stephen, I'm so worried about Stephen." "What's the matter with Stephen?" "He's just moved. He's just gone to art college. He's just moved into a house with 5 girls." Five girls? "I'm so what? Why so 5 girls?" I said, "What you worried about?" "I can't sleep at night." I said, "It's possible Stephen can't sleep at night either." She said, "Don't make fun. 5 girls, Howard. He's never going to be able to get to the bathroom." The bathroom, you see, the bathroom was the secret of my mother's anxieties. The bathroom was the place where we could not hide our bodies. When I went off to Cambridge, finally, when she accepted that I had indeed won a place, she said, "Will you remember to take toilet rolls?" I said, "What, for the whole 3 years?" She said, "They might not have any." I said, "Look, I'm sure at Cambridge." She said, "Look, just take toilet rolls." So I listened to it and I took a couple. I'm just going to turn, this is going to go off and it's going to spoil a story. And the story is this. Whenever anybody in our house went to the lavatory, the rest of the house, if they were upstairs, had to come downstairs. We were not to acknowledge that the body existed. So any of the slight noises that a body might make were not to be heard by the rest of the house. So the word would go out, your mother's upstairs, or your father's upstairs, or Howard's upstairs, or Stephen's upstairs in the toilet. The rest of the house would move downstairs and we'd start singing. So we couldn't hear any noises. So we'd sing, it would vary. We would sing a selection from the song, from the musicals. And once I even remember a whole chorus of the Hallelujah chorus. You would think, wouldn't you, that a boy with this all going on around him, with his parents fighting this ancient war between different kinds of Judaism, it would be a doddle to write novels. It would be dead easy. You couldn't fail. My problem was that I'd grown ashamed of it all. Terrible thing to happen, but it happened. I'd grown ashamed of my mother. Have I told you that my father was a magician? Have I told you that my father bent 6-inch nails? Have I told you that my father ripped telephone directories in half? Have I told you that my father at weddings and bar mitzvahs used to dance the Kazatsky like a Cossack and used to lift up chairs by one leg, sometimes with me in them? So I'm ashamed of my father doing this. Then my mother is in a corner holding her head, ashamed of him. And I'm ashamed of my mother for being ashamed of my father. So what kind of shame? In order to get away from this shame, I decide, yes, I have to write. I'm this alienated, peculiarized being, and I have to write. But I have to write about anything other than this world. And what do I want to write about? I want to write about what Henry James wrote about. I want to write about English country house life. And I want to write it in elegant Henry James sentences. I came from a world in which my father told me off in kind of cod Yiddish. I worked on the markets with him and we had kind of market slang. My mother had her own fantastic language of, oh, I can't, Howard, I can't sleep. And I am wanting to write Henry James prose. Well, psychologically, you can understand it. I need to get away from all that. But you can't write like that. You can't write another person's life for them. I am not saying that it was my job to write about the life I lived. I don't say only write about what you know, because writing, what's important about writing, I think sometimes, is that you don't know what you know and you write to find out what you know. But what I did wrong, it seems to me, was to miss out on the music of the life that I lived, was to not honor the cadences, the extravagance, the inordinacy, and the huge comedy of it. And this, my little memoir, is quite simply the story of how I finally got to write a novel by giving up the whole idea of Henry James and realizing I couldn't do it, or Tolstoy, or Dostoevsky, and not writing the story of my parents and my life there, but realizing the life that I'd been brought up into was funny, that they were funny and that they were exuberant. And I had to find a language of exuberance, comic exuberance, in which to write whatever it was I had to write. And it's a happy story, this. It stops with my first novel. It's published, that's it, the end. But at least I wrote it. And it's lovely to be here, although I can't see any of you, but I can imagine you and be talking to you about it again. Rosie, thank you for inviting me.
Howard, how lovely to see you. And that was absolutely wonderful. And I love all those stories about your mother's hysteria and the catastrophizing. And it does seem like, as you say, it took you quite a long journey to find Howard's voice in all of that. And everyone who is a fan of yours, please buy this book. This has been such a great evening. I can't thank all our speakers enough. It's been so varied, so interesting, and then with so many common strands running through this together. So thank you to Elif and to Julia, to Matthew, from Delia in New York, and to Howard. Please check out the details of the books online and do buy them. And please all have a very happy Easter and join us again soon. And thank you very much for being with us, and good night.
Thank you.
Good night.